Bright and early, Amelia awoke engulfed in an overwhelming sense of melancholy. Today was no ordinary Saturday. It was her wedding day. One would assume she should be brimming with joy, especially considering she was about to unite with the first eligible bachelor in their entire city. However, Harper's only claim to fame was being the fortunate inheritor of his parents' vast wealth. Amelia, a modest and cultured young woman, was deeply in love with her classmate, oblivious to his immense fortune. Material wealth meant little to her. She cherished the affection and comfort she found in her beloved's presence. Now, with tears streaming down her cheeks, she gazed at her wedding gown draped over the rack beside the window. In just a short while, she would have to slip into it to forever bind her life with Harper, whose parents had spared no expense for their son's nuptials. The elderly couple desired that the entire town would commemorate this pivotal moment for their family. Over 1,000 invitations had been dispatched, including to top brass from the local government. One would think Amelia should be over the moon. Such an honor doesn't come to every girl. Yet the bride-to-be felt anything but joy. Quite the opposite, she was devastated, crushed the day before by none other than the groom himself. All through the night, Amelia lay awake, replaying the previous day's events continuously in her mind. Then she might still have been called, arguably, the happiest soul on earth. Today, though, as if cursed by a maleficent spell, she transformed into the epitome of misery. And here's the reason why. On the eve of the 8th night, as was often the case, Harper fetched his fiancé from her residence. He escorted her to a lavish dining establishment, reputed to be the finest in town, a choice reflecting his penchant for upscale venues, as he typically shunned more modest eateries, deeming them unworthy of his presence. This attitude, it should be noted, frequently disheartened his partner. Excessive pride may be off-putting, but love has a way of rendering faults invisible, or at least tolerable. On this particular evening, however, Harper outdid himself. Engaged in light-hearted banter about the morrow's plans, the couple settled into the car and eased into the crawl towards their destination. The culprit behind their sluggish pace, an extensive traffic snarl spanning several miles. Typical, Chain and his clunker are up ahead, hogging the road from folks like me, Harper remarked, a mix of scorn and irritation lacing his words as he peered out the window with disdain at the surrounding vehicles. These cars, he observed, lacked the sophistication and allure of his own top-tier imported automobile, which boasted a bespoke interior, a detail not lost on him as he assessed his surroundings. Oh, come on, darling. Everyone should live within their means. Not everyone can afford the finest things, Amelia replied, her tone carrying a hint of gentle reproach. Harper shot her a peculiar look, almost condescending, barely keeping himself from outright insulting her. Another 30 minutes dragged by. The traffic jam had worsened, much to Harper's frustration as his stomach growled loudly, yearning for a feast. The table was already arranged, the waitstaff stood at the ready, and the cherished guests, much like commoners, were stuck in line. Pity we don't have private choppers like they do in the States to whisk us away in no time. Sadly, we're decades behind the rest of the world here. But no worries, we'll take a little detour. Thankfully, I know this city like the back of my hand. While everyone else is stuck, we'll be feasting, said Harper, veering off the main road and into the side streets. Now things moved along much faster, and within a few minutes, the couple seemed on track to reach their destination. However, just as their goal appeared within grasp, an ambulance, sirens wailing and lights flashing, obstructed their path. Even though he only needed to reverse a couple of meters to get out of his car, he chose not to budge. After all, some elderly lady in the ancient wagon has probably been rushed to the hospital already, And honestly, it's long overdue," Harper muttered with disdain. "So nothing catastrophic will happen if Granny has to wait while the ambulance driver finds his way through the parked vehicles," he added spitefully. Especially considering the brazen driver had the nerve to honk at him to move. The young whippersnapper was, after all, driving down a lane that wasn't even his. A short while later, a doctor emerged from the ambulance and approached Harper's car window, from which loud music was blaring. The doctor explained that they were urgently transporting a grandmother who had suffered a heart attack to the hospital. "She's hanging on by a thread. Every minute counts," the doctor implored. "Go ahead then, who's stopping you?" "I couldn't care less about this grandma and her heart problems," responded the impudent boy, despite Amelia's increasing discomfort. She had already pleaded with her fiancé numerous times to make way for the ambulance. But he refused to listen, convinced that he was the master of his own destiny. With the backing of his father's connections, he felt invincible, having skated by consequences multiple times before. Yet in recent times, his father had grown stricter with him. Perhaps he, too, was running out of patience. It was high time for his son to settle down and grow wiser. After all, Asher wasn't funding his studies just for the sake of his nightclub and disco escapades. They had had a serious conversation about this very matter a week ago. The young man had merely nodded, feigning agreement to his father's arguments. However, once he received another generous sum of money, he promptly forgot about his promise. Now, instead of completely avoiding a traffic dispute, he only added fuel to the fire, creating a full-blown scandal that attracted the attention of the entire neighborhood. Some onlookers even pulled out their phones to capture the scene, eager to share the footage online. Curiously, the major was unperturbed by this fact. In fact, he relished the notoriety, believing that even a negative character could be celebrated as a hero. And what a hero he would be. Amelia yearned to sink into the earth with embarrassment. At that moment, the young woman couldn't fathom what drew her to such a cold-hearted brute. Perhaps love truly is blind. Yet it stood to reason that any rational bride would rethink her commitment following such an incident. For affection and gentle sentiments can surely nurture and redirect anyone. A serious conversation with Harper was all that was needed. If his feelings were genuine, he would undoubtedly change, Amelia mused. Meanwhile, the roadside altercation was dragging on. In a bid to defuse the situation, the ambulance driver contemplated reversing his vehicle. There seemed to be no other option. Just then, the scenario took an astonishing turn. Inside the ambulance, alongside her grandmother, sat a distraught granddaughter, tears streaming down her face. To the elderly woman, this tall young girl was her sole companion, having raised Olivia all by herself. The young woman's mother had deemed her a youthful blunder, an unwelcome child who was hindering her from crafting the life she envisioned. So, abandoning her daughter to her grandmother's care, the wayward mother set off to chase after the affections of European men, ultimately losing herself in that quest. Emma was always a model child, much to her grandmother's delight, who never once had to voice concerns about her behavior or academic achievements, both at school and later at the university. Moreover, she shone brightly in athletics, particularly in weightlifting, which she pursued at the town's renowned sports center. However, an unexpected calamity befell their modest household. Already frail with age, Olivia's health began to decline sharply yet subtly, as she made every effort to mask her worsening condition. She did this to spare Emma any worry, especially since her granddaughter was gearing up for an upcoming hammer throw competition. But illness has a way of striking unseen, and it struck her down severely. Fortunately, Emma was at her side when the crisis hit. Otherwise, Olivia wouldn't have managed to even call for help. The girl was oblivious to the commotion around her, consumed by concern for someone close to her heart. However, when her father returned to the vehicle, venting his frustration, she finally snapped out of her troubling thoughts. Upon discovering the cause for their halt, her anger flared. Releasing her beloved grandmother's hand, she leaped out of the car and strode towards the smug officer, who was reveling in his triumph over the common folk once more. But in an instant, something happened that he could never have anticipated. Emma charged at him like a whirlwind of fury. She was well aware that reasoning with such self-important individuals would be futile. Stronger actions were necessary, and she was ready to take them. With a swift motion, she yanked open the car door and seized the guy by the collar of his fancy jacket, dragging him out with ease. In her haste, she accidentally nudged Harper, catching him off guard. He certainly hadn't seen that coming. Following her dramatic victory, Emma took the initiative to move his car, clearing the path for an approaching ambulance. Harper was hollering like a lunatic, threatening to lock the girl up for the beatings, not to mention for swiping the car along with his fiancé, about whom the athlete could only muster a bit of sympathy. Whatever the case, just a few minutes later, the yard was empty. Clearly, any plans for a dinner out were dashed. Indeed, the conclusion of the day turned out to be quite a spectacle for the soon-to-be weds. Rather than indulge in enjoyable pursuits, Harper vowed to take revenge on the offender, to which Amelia snapped back that he was the one who had brought this upon himself. It was a harsh dose of reality for her. From her future husband, she had to endure a barrage of furious remarks. Never had she witnessed Harper in such a rage. Unfortunately for her, that was just the beginning of her troubles. As she arrived home, she swiftly retreated to her room, seeking solace and reflecting on the recent events. To her sudden dismay, she realized that she had left behind her purse. Unaware of the foreign car's departure, she made the decision to return and retrieve it. As she stepped outside the gate, her eyes fell upon Harper, concealed behind a lilac bush. He was engaged in a phone conversation, and his words left her utterly astonished. "Didn't I warn you? This timid girl would become mine," he exclaimed. "But you refused to believe. Well, now you have what you wanted. I am using her, residing under her roof." Overwhelmed by these statements, she dialed a familiar number and uttered, "I agree." Subsequently, the bewildered bride packed a small bag and, taking advantage of her slumbering parents, stealthily departed from the house, leaving a note upon the table. The wedding was just hours away. Asher and Ava, parents of the groom, were already in full swing welcoming the esteemed attendees, as nearly all the guests hailed from the groom's side. The poor couple nearly passed out when the matchmakers relayed the bombshell that the wedding was off. The bride had taken off with her old school chum right before tying the knot. And indeed, that's how it went down. For ages, Amelia's relationship with Lincoln had been purely platonic. She had always declined his romantic overtures, but in the wake of betrayal, the girl came to realize who she truly loved. Although he didn't have much in the way of wealth, Lincoln was a diligent and hard-working fellow. He proposed to Amelia that they should relocate somewhere remote, far beyond the reach of the genuine elite. The groom's parents, for their part, would not entertain such an indignity within their ranks. Surely it was unheard of, a wedding called off due to the bride's absence. Consequently, Ava laid out a straightforward plan to her spouse to escape a potential fiasco among esteemed guests. Following her grandmother's admission to the hospital, Emma trudged back to her home the next day. The girl had spent an entire night by her grandmother's side and rose at daybreak to collect a few necessities for the elder. Mired in sorrow, Emma received no reassuring news from the physicians regarding her grandmother's recovery prospects. They insinuated that while surgery might offer a glimmer of hope, it was only accessible in a handful of overseas hospitals and would cost a fortune. Even if they liquidated all their assets, including their modest Khrushchev-era flat, the funds still wouldn't suffice for this noble endeavor. No charitable funds will allocate funds to rescue an elderly woman when there are younger and more promising candidates. The granddaughter felt a sense of hopelessness, as it is truly devastating when you have the opportunity to save a loved one, yet are unable to do anything. However, fate decided to bestow an unexpected surprise upon the young woman. She was taken aback when a senior gentleman in a luxurious suit emerged from the opulent mansion she was passing by. He presented her with an offer that she could not possibly decline given her predicament. Harper was livid upon discovering that his fiancée had left him in a state of foolishness. The young man was not accustomed to losing, and within a mere day, he experienced humiliation twice over. Moreover, it was inflicted by women whom he had always treated with disrespect, utilizing them for his vile and unrelenting desires. Nonetheless, regardless of his feelings, they had cleverly outwitted him. Harper had no choice but to agree to a pretend marriage. The Major had no alternative solution. Naturally, there was no need for a dowry or any other formalities. However, the tall and rather robust bride arrived punctually at the registry office. When she unveiled her face, the groom was left utterly speechless, realizing that it was the same young woman who had essentially put him in an incredibly awkward situation. The nuptial ceremony was a triumph in its own right, notwithstanding the groom's deeply displeased countenance. Following the merriments, the newlyweds were slated to embark upon their inaugural connubial eve within the abode bestowed by the groom's progenitors. However, the moment the wedding car vanished from sight, the bride's radiant and dulcet smile morphed into a sneering grin. "Well, dear husband, it appears that we must now address your upbringing. It was, after all, due to your negligence that time was squandered, resulting in my grandmother's precarious condition. Let us implore the divine forces that the surgical intervention proves efficacious," Emma exclaimed, delivering a sharp slap to her quivering spouse as she yanked him by the hand, propelling them both into the domicile for an earnest tête-à-tête. Well, there's no escaping now, the newlywed sighed to himself as he trailed behind his wife. Little did he know, divorce was a foreign concept in his grandmother's family. One burden is enough, after all, why stress the elderly lady unnecessarily, especially considering her fragile health? Thankfully, Emma had managed to transform her groom into a proper husband, much to the delight of his parents. Regrettably, it had taken a bit of force to get to this point. But what else could one expect, considering their obstinate nature? At least the runaway bride no longer had to resort to such measures, realizing what true happiness felt like, being with someone who genuinely loved her. The nuptial ceremony was a triumph in its own right, notwithstanding the groom's deeply displeased countenance. Following the merriments, the newlyweds were slated to embark upon their inaugural connubial eve within the abode bestowed by the groom's progenitors. However, the moment the wedding car vanished from sight, the bride's radiant and dulcet smile morphed into a sneering grin. "Well, dear husband, it appears that we must now address your upbringing. It was, after all, due to your negligence that time was squandered, resulting in my grandmother's precarious condition. Let us implore the divine forces that the surgical intervention proves efficacious," Emma exclaimed, delivering a sharp slap to her quivering spouse as she yanked him by the hand, propelling them both into the domicile for an earnest tête-à-tête. Well, there's no escaping now, the newlywed sighed to himself as he trailed behind his wife. Little did he know, divorce was a foreign concept in his grandmother's family. One burden is enough, after all, why stress the elderly lady unnecessarily, especially considering her fragile health? Thankfully, Emma had managed to transform her groom into a proper husband, much to the delight of his parents. Regrettably, it had taken a bit of force to get to this point. But what else could one expect, considering their obstinate nature? At least the runaway bride no longer had to resort to such measures, realizing what true happiness felt like, being with someone who genuinely loved her.